So you want to create a path all the way to the house. So you go to sculpt mode and sculpt the path. Then you also created a weight paint for the displacement. Then you also created a vertex color to blend the two materials, one for the ground and the other for the path. Then you also added some foliage using the weight paint. But then you don't like the positioning of the house, so you move it to anywhere else. And now you have to do the entire work again. Kind of. But
what if?
I told you that there's a better way. Introducing Pathway Generator for Blender 3.0. By leveraging the power of geometry nodes, you can create a system which generates pathways from the curves. So you only have to draw a curve and it'll create a path from that. But it's not the end. You can also change the width and the depth of the path. And also the path will have a different material than the ground without needing you to create a vertex color. And you also don't need to create a weight paint to distribute something. And if you move the curve, then the path will update in real time. And also the foliage won't appear on the path. And now you can move your house wherever you want and change the path as you wish.
Before we get started,
if you want to learn how to create sci-fi nature environment concept art in Blender, then check out this great course by Pedro Blanco where he shares his workflow to get the best quality result by mixing 2D and 3D software. So if you are interested, then use the coupon code down in the description to get 15% off. And let me let you know that these project files are available on my Gumroad for only $5. So if you want to support my channel, then that's a great way of doing that. So it includes the cabin scene that I showed you in the video, and also a second blend file that only has the procedural pathway generator. So if you want to reuse the procedural pathway generator in your project files, then you can append the nodes from this blend file. So let's quickly see how we can do that. So here I have a very simple setup and it's just a basic plane. So I'm gonna scale it up by a factor of 5 and make sure to apply the scale so that it doesn't cause any problems. Then go to File and Append. And here are the two blend files, but what we need is the procedural pathway generator. So double click on that blend file and now go to node tree and select the pathway generator, then click append. And it also adds a curve. So now select the plane and go to the modifier properties and add a geometry nodes modifier. And now select the pathway generator node tree from here. And it's very low resolution because by default the subdivision level is set to 1 so that Blender doesn't crash if you have subdivisions already. So now let's increase the subdivision level. And now we can select our path, go to edit mode, and I'm gonna delete this curve, and now select this draw option. And before we draw the curve, make sure to change this from cursor to surface so that we can draw on the surface of this plane. Now let's draw something like this. And now you can see that it has created a path. And you can also change the width and also the depth of the path as well. And you can also append the material. So let's go to File, Append. And now let's go into the material and select this terrain material and click append. And now let's give that material to this plane. And now let's go to rendered view and I'm going to use one of the default HDRIs. And you can see that it has a ground material, but the path doesn't have a different material as I showed you. So in order to have this path a different material, what you have to do is you have to go to the modifier properties And in the geometry nodes modifier, click on this drop down arrow, and in the path attribute type in path, and it is case sensitive, so make sure that you are typing right. And right now we are using a curve to deform this plane, but you can use any object that you want. So let me show you what I mean by that. So I'm gonna add a mesh, let's say a UV sphere, and I'm gonna scale this up a bit like that. And now in the object you can select any object that you want. So let's select the sphere. And now you can see that this UV sphere is displacing this plane. How cool is that? So there are a lot of possibilities of what you can do with this tool. And if you create something cool, then let me know by tagging me on Instagram or Twitter. And to have more control over this, you can even tweak the settings in the geometry nodes. So you can create a new geometry nodes workspace. And if you can't see the nodes in the geometry nodes, then press A to select everything, then press the period key on the numpad to get back to the nodes. And now from here you can tweak the settings. So now with that all being said, let's open up a new fresh blend file and create this from scratch. So I'm gonna start off by deleting everything. Then I'm gonna add a plane for the ground, and I'm gonna scale it up to maybe 5 times. And whenever you scale objects in object mode, make sure to apply the scale. And when you do that, you can see that the scale is now set to 1. And if you don't apply the scales, then it can cause some problems. So now let's create a new geometry nodes workspace because there's not one by default. And now I'm going to collapse this spreadsheet editor. And now let's create a new geometry nodes tree. And I'm going to rename it to pathway creator or generator. And to displace this plane, we need subdivisions. So I'm going to add a subdivide mesh node. And if you haven't watched my previous videos on geometry nodes for beginners, then I recommend watching them first because I'm not gonna go in that detail in this video because I've explained those things in those videos. So if you haven't watched them, then you can do so by clicking the I button. So now I'm gonna subdivide this at a level of 6, which is the maximum. And now we need a curve. So I'm gonna add a curve and I'm gonna add a Bezier curve. And let's scale it up by a value of 5 and make sure to apply the scale. And now we need to displace the plane where this curve is. So how do we get the distance between this curve and this plane? So for that, there's a node called geometry proximity. And now we can target a geometry and output the distance. So the target has to be our curve. So we can drag and drop this curve into the geometry nodes tree. And now I'm going to use this geometry as the target. And now to displace this plane, I'm going to add a set position node. And now I'm going to select these nodes and I'm going to move these here for more space. And now I'm going to add a position node and I'm going to connect that to the position and nothing will happen. And again, if you haven't watched my previous video, then I recommend watching that first because I've explained these things in that video. So now when we have got this position input, we can add this distance to this position. So what we need is a vector math node because position is a vector. And you can confirm that because it's purple. And now we need a combined XYZ node because we only want to displace our plane on the Z axis. So now we can just plug this distance into the Z input and now connect this to this vector math node. And you can see nothing's happening. And that's because there's an error. And if you hover the mouse over that, you can see that it says that geometry proximity doesn't support a curve.
What do we do now? What the hell do we do now?
Calm down, calm down. So what we can do is we can add a curve to mesh node. And now before the geometry proximity, we can convert our curve to a mesh. And why isn't it still working? And that's because in the geometry proximity, you can see that it's calculating the faces, but our curve doesn't have any faces. So instead, we want to switch it to edges. And now you can see something's happening, but it's not what we want. So now what we need is a color ramp. So now I'm going to plug this after the geometry proximity node. And now you can see it working. And now our plane is from a value of 0 to a value of 1 on the z-axis. So this is 0 on the z-axis, and this is 1 unit on the z-axis, and this is 2, 3, 4, and so on. So now our plane is from a value of 0 to a value of 1 on the z-axis, because black equals to a value of 0 and white equals to a value of 1. But before adding the color ramp, it was going up like that. And now when we add this color ramp node, you can see that it's clamped from a value of 0 to a value of 1. And let me hide this annotation. Where is that? Here it is. And also when we add this color ramp, we have these handles which we can use to have more control over this path. But you'd notice that when we displaced this plane, it moved up. But we don't want to move the plane up. Instead, what we want is to move the path down. And that's happening because this vector math node is set to add. So it's adding this distance value to its position. But instead, we want to subtract it. So I'm going to set that to subtract. And now it's subtracting, but the effect is inverted. So let me show you what's happening now. So to visualize this, I'm going to connect this color ramp to this group output. And now we can choose an attribute to store that data. So I want to use a weight paint. So I'm going to create a new vertex group and I'm going to call that paths. And now I'm going to choose that vertex group from here. And now let's go to weight paint mode, and we can't see anything. And the reason why it's not showing up is the type of data is set to color, but we want to set it to float, and float is a single value. And now you can see this distance value in the form of a weight paint. So now I'm going to disconnect this for a moment. So if you don't know, in weight paint, the blue color indicates a value of 0 and the red value indicates to a value of 1 and everything in between. So wherever we have our path, it will have a value of 0, and where we don't have our path, it will have a value of 1. And also the position of this plane on the z-axis is 0 because it's on the grid floor. And what we are doing now is we are subtracting this distance value from this position. So our position is 0 and you can see the distance in the weight paint. So when we subtract 0 from 0, it will be 0, and when we subtract 1 from 0, then it will be -1. And that's actually what's happening. You can see that where the blue color is, it's at the value of 0 on the z-axis, and where the red color is, it's a value of -1 it's a value of -1 on the z-axis. So what we want is to have a value of 1 where the path is and to have a value of 0 where the path is not. So we can just flip the distance by this color ramp. So you can click on this button and flip the color ramp. And now you can see that where the path is, it's red, and where it's not, it's blue, and everything in between. So now I'm gonna reconnect this. And now I'm gonna go out of weight paint mode, and also let me delete these annotations. And now you can see this working. And also in the color ramp, we can change the interpolation mode. So I'm gonna change that to B-spline because it's smoother. And I'm gonna move this handle to here, and I'm gonna move this one to something like this. And also I'm gonna shade this smooth. So now how do we control the width of this path? So what we can do is before this color ramp, we can add a math node and set it to multiply. And now you can use this value to control the width of this path. And if you want to visualize this, then you can go to weight paint mode and disconnect this for a moment. And now you can see that what it's doing. So I'm gonna reconnect this and I'm gonna go to object mode. So now you can use this value to control the width of this path. But now how do we control the depth of this path also? So what we can do is first I'm gonna add a readout node here. And now what we can do is we can add a math node and also set this to multiply. But this time I'm gonna plug it after. But this time I'm gonna plug this after the color ramp. And now we can use this value to make it shallow like this or deep like this. So if you also want to see how this works, then you can go to weight paint mode and I'm going to disconnect this for a moment. And now when we decrease this value, you can see that it's becoming blue, which means the value is decreasing. And when we increase this, you can see that it's becoming more and more red, and that means the value is increasing. So for now, I'm gonna set this to a value of something like 0.7 or 0.8. And you can plug any socket into the group input node, and then you'll be able to change that value from the geometry nodes modifier. And that's pretty cool and also handy. So if you want to change a value, then you don't need to go deep into the nodes to change that. And instead, you can change that value from the geometry nodes modifier. And also you can rename these inputs from the properties panel by hitting N. And I'm gonna rename this to path width because it controls the width of the path. And also I'm gonna plug this input into the group input node, and I'm gonna change this one to path depth because this value controls the depth of the path. And now let us see how we can draw the paths. So for that I'm gonna select this curve and I'm gonna go to edit mode, and now you can select this draw option. And before we draw, make sure to change this from cursor to surface so we can draw on the surface of this plane. And also before we draw, I'm gonna delete this curve by hitting X. And as soon as we do that, you'll notice that our plane is moved down. And you'd say that it's not a pretty big problem, but it can be annoying sometimes. And also it creates a problem. So I'm gonna show you what that problem is. So I'm gonna draw a curve like this, and when I draw the curve, you can see that it is below the plane. But we don't want this curve below the plane because the depth of this path depends on how close this curve is to the plane. So if I now draw a curve again, this path is gonna be more deep than this path because this curve is closer to the plane than this one. So that creates a problem. And if you can't notice the difference, then let me go to object mode and select this plane, and I'm gonna change the path depth to 1, and also I'm gonna disconnect this for a moment. And now let's go to weight paint, and now you can see that this one is having more weight than this one, and that's because this curve is closer to this plane than this one. So that's a problem. So how do we fix it? So before fixing it, let's see what's happening. I'm gonna reconnect this. So after the geometry proximity, we flipped the color ramp because we didn't want this path to go up like that. So now where the path is, it is blue, which is a value of 0, and everywhere else is red, which is a value of 1. So we are subtracting this distance value from the position. So the position of our plane is 0. So when we subtract 0 from 0, it will be 0. So where the path is, it is not being displaced at all, but where there is red, it is being moved down to -1 on the z-axis because subtracting 1 from 0 will be -1. And I'm gonna disconnect this object info node, so it would be the same if we delete the curve. So now you can see that everything becomes blue, which means a value of 0. So now subtracting 0 from this position input, which is 0, would do nothing. But then we flip the color ramp. So the blue will become red, and red equals to a value of 1, so it would be moved down. So that's why the plane is being moved down when we delete the curve. So let me reconnect this geometry to the curve. And we do want to flip the color ramp because when we don't, you can see that our path is moved up. So now I'm going to show you the way that worked for me. So before I do that, let me delete these annotations. And now I'm going to go to object mode. So now I'm going to show you the way to fix it. So I'm going to select the curve and I'm going to go to edit mode, and first I'm going to delete everything. So now let's add a curve, and I'm going to add a Bezier curve. And I'm going to scale it down to 0 so you can see it. But it's still affecting the plane. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move it down below this plane. So now it's not affecting the plane, and also I'm going to press H to hide it. And now you can happily draw the curve and also delete it, and the plane will stay at the same place because there's still a curve, but we hide it. So now let me draw a path, something like this. So that's it for this video guys, and in the next part we'll continue to create this. So in the next part we'll be giving this path a different material and this ground a different material. We'll also see how to displace this plane and also how to distribute something on this plane but not on the path. So stay tuned, and if you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up so more and more people can find it, and subscribe to the channel for the next part. I'll be back.